Every headline you read today, every airstrike, every siren, every protest across the world is part of a story that began decades ago, to the moment when maps were redrawn, when promises were broken, and when history took a turn that still shapes our world today. The Arab-Israeli conflict isn't just a chapter in history, it's one of the greatest political fault lines of our time, a fault line that still has the power to spark a global war. But where did it all begin? The story starts in the aftermath of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and its lands were divided. By 1947, the United Nations voted on a plan. Palestine would be split into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The vote passed. 33 nations supported it, 13 opposed. The United States and Soviet Union voted in favor. Pakistan, India, Iran, and Saudi Arabia rejected it outright. The result? Jews, just 570,000 people, were given 55% of the land. Arabs, 1.2 million people, the majority, were left with only 45%. Worse, the map was a tangled puzzle. Palestinian towns were cut off from one another, separated by Jewish zones. For Jews, this was a dream fulfilled, a homeland after centuries of exile. They celebrated. For Arabs, it was a betrayal. To them, all of Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, was theirs. Many Jews, they argued, were recent arrivals fleeing Europe. Why should outsiders take their homeland? The Arabs rejected the plan and prepared for war. Tensions exploded immediately. Both sides stockpiled weapons, villages fortified themselves, and street battles broke out across Palestine. But at first, this wasn't yet a regional war. It was civil war. The British were still in control until May 14, 1948, and no foreign army could legally enter until they withdrew. That left the Palestinians on their own, and they were at a severe disadvantage. The Jewish community, led by David Ben-Gurion, was organized and disciplined. They already had militias, fortified settlements, and even a military blueprint, Operation Delay, a plan to seize key areas the moment the British left. This force would become the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF. The Palestinians, meanwhile, were fragmented. There was no central command. Each village relied on a few dozen poorly armed men. Nearly half of all villages had no fighters at all. Some, desperate to survive, signed local truces with Jewish militias. The imbalance was clear. The Jews had structure, weapons, and a plan. The Arabs had anger, but little else. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal wars of the 20th century, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, a war that would redraw maps, uproot millions, and leave scars that still define the Middle East today. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep going, and I appreciate every single one of you for being here. Then came an event that shook the Arab world to its core, the tragedy of Deir Yassin. It was a small Palestinian village near Jerusalem, home to about 750 people, farmers, families, children. Believing themselves safe, the villagers had even signed a peace pact with a nearby Jewish settlement. But on April 9, 1948, that fragile peace was shattered. Around 120 Jewish paramilitaries stormed the village, claiming enemy fighters were hiding there, a claim still debated to this day. House by house, grenades exploded, gunfire tore through walls, and resistance was crushed. By the end, more than 100 civilians lay dead. Survivors fled in terror, and the village was reduced to rubble. For Palestinians, Deir Yassin wasn't just the loss of a single community, it was the spark of mass fear. Entire villages began emptying overnight, families leaving behind homes, land, and memories, clinging only to the hope of survival. This wasn't chaos by accident, it was part of a chilling strategy to spread terror and clear territory for control. To this day, the name Deir Yassin echoes as a symbol of catastrophe. Deir Yassin was wiped from the map. Only fragments of its buildings remain, now absorbed into a hospital in Jerusalem. The massacre horrified the Arab world and disturbed many Jews as well. Leaders of the Central Jewish Army condemned it, calling it a stain on their struggle. Jerusalem's chief rabbi declared those responsible should be cast out of the community. Even the Jewish agency sent an apology to King Abdullah of Jordan, but the king refused to accept it. Facing outrage, the militias defended themselves, claiming they had warned civilians, moved women and children to safety, and that their attack was no worse than those of Israel's own army. But no excuses could erase the horror. The damage was irreversible. Fear rippled across Palestine. Entire villages near Jewish areas were abandoned as families fled en masse. This wave of displacement became known as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. As Arab anger surged, retaliation became inevitable. Israel's leaders, sensing the storm, tried one final time to negotiate. Ben-Gurion sent Golda Meir, disguised in Arab dress, across the border into Jordan. Golda Meir's secret mission was daring and desperate. Meeting King Abdullah face to face, she pleaded for peace. But the king's words were final. Before Deir Yassin, I could have acted alone. Now, 5 Arab nations are bound to this fight. I cannot turn back. With that, the last chance for diplomacy collapsed. Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq were preparing for all-out war. Then came May 14, 1948, the end of the British Mandate. That midnight, on the banks of the Jordan River, King Abdullah fired a single shot into the sky, the signal to begin. Arab armies surged across the border, fighter planes roared overhead, and bombs rained down on Tel Aviv, the same city where hours earlier David Ben-Gurion had declared the birth of the State of Israel. Within minutes of its creation, Israel was at war. The war widens, and the battle for Jerusalem. But the skies over Tel Aviv didn't remain one-sided for long. Israeli defenses managed to shoot down an Egyptian fighter plane, giving their people a much-needed surge of morale. In just days, armies from Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq had poured into Palestine. This was the beginning of what Israelis call the War of Independence, and what Arabs remember as Al-Nakba, the Great Catastrophe. At first glance, the Arab nations seemed to have the advantage. They had tanks, artillery, and fighter planes, weapons the newborn Israeli state lacked. On paper, they claimed 75 aircraft, 40 tanks, 300 armored vehicles, and 140 cannons. But reality was very different. The combined Arab armies had only about 23,000 soldiers in the field, spread thin across multiple fronts. Many lacked proper training, and much of their equipment was outdated or never reached the battlefield. Among them, one force stood apart, the Jordanian Arab Legion. Well-trained, well-equipped, and led by British and Australian officers, it was the only Arab army the Israelis truly feared. Yet even the Legion had limits. Only 10,000 men in total, with just 6,500 deployed to the front. Despite the odds, the Arab advance pressed forward, and soon the focus of the war turned to the holiest of cities, Jerusalem. For decades, Jerusalem had been under British control, but on May 15, 1948, the British withdrew, leaving the sacred city divided. The old city, with Al-Aqsa and other holy sites, remained on one side, while the newer, largely Jewish districts lay on the other. Panic swept the old city's residents. Telegrams rushed to King Abdullah of Jordan. "The Jews are coming. Send help before it's too late." And the king answered. He ordered the Arab Legion into Jerusalem. By May 17th, Legion soldiers secured key positions, even capturing a fort along the road that linked West Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. The result was devastating. West Jerusalem came under siege. Bombardment began. Day and night, shells hammered the city. A Jewish official would later recall, there wasn't a single house in West Jerusalem that wasn't hit. Not a single family that hadn't lost someone. In just 2 weeks, one hospital alone received over 1,000 dead and wounded. Food and water grew scarce. Strict rations were imposed. Desperate to break the siege, Israeli forces launched 5 major assaults on the Latrun fortress, the gateway to Jerusalem. All 5 failed, but in desperation they carved out a new supply route through rocky hills. It became known as the Burma Road, and soon convoys of food and water were rumbling into Jerusalem again, easing the chokehold. Inside the old city, the Jewish quarter still held out, defended by a small, outnumbered garrison. But on May 19th, the Arab Legion launched a full-scale assault. Street by street, house by house, they advanced with tanks in superior numbers, overwhelming the defenders. Desperate religious leaders wired Israel's chief rabbis. "Our community is on the brink of massacre. Our synagogues destroyed. Our Torah scrolls burned. Save us," but no reinforcements arrived. On May 26th to 27th, Arab forces stormed the Herva synagogue, the largest and most historic in the quarter. A deafening blast reduced it to rubble. Photographs from that day show a Legion soldier standing on the ruins, a chilling symbol of the quarter's fall. By May 28th, the end had come. 2 rabbis carrying white flags approached the Arab Legion commander to plead for terms. The decision inside the quarter was unanimous: surrender. Women, children, and the elderly were promised safe passage, while the men were taken prisoner. But as the first groups of civilians left, an angry mob descended, seeking revenge for Deir Yassin. Chaos erupted. Stones and curses filled the air. Then, in a surprising turn, Arab Legion soldiers intervened. Forming a cordon, they shielded the civilians, carrying the wounded, feeding the weak, and escorting them safely to West Jerusalem. One prisoner later recalled, "We were certain we would be massacred, but the Legion saved us from the mob and treated us with unexpected kindness." When the evacuation was complete, the mob looted and destroyed the abandoned homes. The Jewish quarter had fallen. Soon after, King Abdullah himself arrived in Jerusalem. He was greeted as a hero, and at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre he met with Christian clergy, assuring them that Jerusalem's holy places and communities would remain under his protection. The battle for Jerusalem was far from over. From May to July, Israeli forces bombarded the old city with mortars and airstrikes. Shells crashed into stone walls, fighter planes roared overhead, but the old city remained firmly in Arab hands. For the Arab world, this was more than a military success. It was a historic and symbolic victory. For the first time since 1917, when the British had seized Jerusalem from the Ottomans, Al-Quds, Beit al-Maqdis, was once again under Muslim control. But while Arabs celebrated in Jerusalem, the wider war was slipping away from them. On May 29, 1948, the United Nations imposed a sweeping arms embargo across the Middle East. It was meant to be neutral, but in practice, it hit the Arab armies far harder than it hit Israel. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Cannons fell silent for lack of shells. Egypt's air fleet, 52 planes at the start of the war, was soon reduced to just 10 or 15 that could actually take off. Spare parts vanished, fuel supplies ran thin, and equipment broke down faster than it could be repaired. Meanwhile, Israel was quietly growing stronger. Wealthy Jews in Europe and America raised a staggering $129 million to fund the war effort. With that money, Israel built a secret global network to smuggle arms, often from black markets overflowing with leftover weapons from World War II. This covert effort became known as Operation Balak. Machine guns, armored vehicles, and fighter planes began pouring into Israel. Among them, 3 American B-17 bombers and dozens of Avia fighter jets purchased from Czechoslovakia. And the weapons weren't the only reinforcement. Pilots, mechanics, and war veterans from abroad, some motivated by ideology, others simply chasing adventure, offered their skills. With their help, Israel built a modern air force almost overnight. It was a transformation that would soon tip the balance of the war. On May 29, 1948, Israeli fighter planes carried out their first ever combat mission, an airstrike on an Egyptian convoy. The raid caused heavy damage, though 2 Israeli aircraft were lost. Just 5 days later, on June 3, Israel scored its first aerial victory, shooting down 2 Egyptian bombers. From that moment, Israel went on the offensive. The new air force struck targets not only in Palestine but across the Arab world: Damascus, Cairo, even Amman. In Amman, bombs struck near the royal palace and a British military base. Furious, Britain threatened retaliation, and Israel quickly halted its raids there. But the message was unmistakable. The Israeli Air Force was no longer on the defensive. By the war's end, Israel commanded the skies. This rapid rise had another secret: France. Despite the UN embargo, French officials quietly funneled weapons to Israel. Shipments left French ports with paperwork claiming they were bound for Latin America, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, but their true destination was Tel Aviv. From France came H-35 light tanks, stockpiles of World War II weapons, and endless crates of ammunition. Israel even salvaged abandoned British naval ships and Sherman tanks left behind after the mandate. Meanwhile, inside Israel, underground arms factories roared to life. By October, they had turned out 16,000 machine guns, millions of bullets, and countless grenades. One of these clandestine plants, the Elon Institute, survives today as a museum, a tribute to Israel's wartime ingenuity. The numbers told the story. By late 1948, the Israeli army had swelled to 120,000 fighters, bolstered by volunteers from around the world. The combined Arab forces, barely 70,000 troops from Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and scattered Palestinian militias. The imbalance was growing. In the north, Lebanese troops briefly captured villages along the border, but quickly handed them to the Arab Liberation Army, an undisciplined militia. Within weeks, Israeli forces counterattacked, retook the villages, and even pushed 8 kilometers inside Lebanon. The tide of war was turning. The Syrian army's offensive soon ground to a halt, crippled by shortages of weapons and manpower. The Iraqi army, entering Palestine through Jordan, took up defensive positions in the West Bank, but with no direct border of its own and limited resources, Iraq's role in the war was minor. The Jordanians, after capturing East Jerusalem and the West Bank, also stalled. In the south, the Egyptians advanced boldly through the Sinai Desert, reaching Ashdod, just 42 kilometers from Tel Aviv, but Israeli forces counterattacked, halting their progress and pushing them back into Gaza. Then, in a daring maneuver, Jewish troops bypassed Gaza altogether, driving deep into the Sinai and advancing toward the Egyptian city of Al-Arish. For a moment it seemed Egypt itself might be threatened, but here the balance of global politics intervened. Britain, Egypt's ally, issued sharp warnings to Israel: withdraw or face retaliation. Reluctantly, Israel pulled its troops out of the Sinai. Still, Israel's dominance was spreading, not only on land and in the air, but also at sea. On October 22, 1948, Israeli commandos rammed 3 explosive boats into Egyptian vessels off the Gaza coast. One ship, the Emir Farouk, was sunk, another crippled. Earlier in June, the Israeli Air Force and Navy had foiled an Egyptian airstrike near Jaffa, further solidifying their edge. By March 1949, the war was over. Israel had secured victory on every front. The United Nations partition plan had allocated 55% of Palestine to the Jews, but by the war's end, Israel controlled 75%. Egypt retained the Gaza Strip. Jordan held East Jerusalem and the West Bank, but for the Palestinians, the consequences were devastating. More than 500 villages captured by Israel were destroyed. Around 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes, many believing they would one day return. They locked their doors and carried the keys with them. Those keys became symbols, worn around necks, passed down to children, cherished as tokens of memory and hope. But the return never came. Today, the descendants of those refugees number nearly 5.9 million, many still living in camps across the region. This mass displacement is remembered as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. In one iconic photograph, Jewish officer Avraham Eden raises the Israeli flag over the coastal city of Eilat, a symbol of Israel's triumph in 1948. But victory came at a heavy price. The war claimed the lives of 6,373 Jews, around 1,300 Palestinians, and 7,000 Arab soldiers. The Arab world was left stunned and humiliated. Among the defeated soldiers was a young officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser. He would never forget the sting of 1948. Years later, as Egypt's president, he closed the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping and imposed a blockade, setting the stage for the next great conflict. And this time, the war would not pit Israel against the Arab states alone. Britain and France, once allies of Egypt, would switch sides to support Israel. But Egypt had powerful new backers of its own, including the rising giant of the Cold War, the Soviet Union. How could Egypt confront three military powers at once? Who would emerge victorious? And how would this war reshape the entire Middle East? All of this will unfold in the second episode of the Arab-Israel Wars.
And while you are there, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and thumbs up. It really helps us keep going, and I really appreciate all of you for tuning in. And I will see you in the next video.